So, there are some topics which you know you're going to have to repeat, because they're important foundational topics. And some students will get the topic from one perspective in one discussion, and some students will need it from a different direction. And that's okay. That's one of the first things you learn as an academic. That's not necessarily you failing, because some academics do treat that as them failing. That's you've got 800 students in the class, or 1,000 students in the class, or maybe you just 100 or 20 students in the class, and they have differing learning needs. They learn in different ways. Some people learn visually, some learn figuratively, some learn by reading descriptive words. Some, and I've had students who who literally will learn this way, learn best by relating the facts and realities to fiction, which they find more palatable. They are more able to absorb the information if it's related to something which is part of their acceptable world. They prefer the fictional world, where good people always triumph and everything works out nice in the end. That's not history. Sadly, I hope I'm not shocking anyone to say this, but good people do not always triumph. Sometimes the bad guys really do win. Sometimes the bad guys are bad from one perspective, but are not that bad from other perspectives. And sometimes it's just a complete mess and everyone's just doing what they think best to survive and do look after what is theirs, and no one's really bad. They just do nasty things. Which can still make them bad people because they do nasty things, but the thing is, they're not necessarily doing it for nasty reasons. In that they're not doing it because they want to take over the world. They're doing it because they see that as the way of protecting what is theirs. And they lose themselves in the process. Or they win themselves. Anyway, why am I bringing this up? Well, in this month's videos, especially when we're talking about the first month of the year of the aircraft carrier, you will have already had the beginnings of naval aviation. And you've had a discussion of flight deck cruisers. And those things. And a bit of 809 Squadron. And pretty much every single video that I'm talking about this month is a different entry point into a year of aircraft carriers, into a year of naval aviation, into telling the naval aviation story through the prism of the ships that provide it to the fleet. Now, why am I doing it this way? Because people will find different ways into a subject. And I can do my best to facilitate that. Some will have liked the more theoretical flow-through as exemplified by the naval aviation discussion. Thank you. If you like that, I'm glad. If you didn't like that, maybe this topic, this discussion, this methodology will be better for you and will help you get into the topic more. That's the purpose of it. And honestly, before anyone chimes in and goes, no, you should be looking at this ship or that ship, there is a reason I've picked Ark Royal. There is a reason I have picked Ark Royal. Because no other name typifies the development of aircraft carriers through the years more than Ark Royal. You might want to pick Enterprise. I could understand it. But the trouble is there being two Enterprises. They've both been good ships. There's a third one coming. They are all good ships. I'm sure the third one will be just as good. And I wish there was another Ark Royal coming. But in terms of the progress development, you had a World War II fleet carrier, and then you've had, which was a really cool ship, and then you've had a nuclear fleet carrier. To be honest, the development is not that great between the two. It's grows dramatically in size, I will admit. But in terms of illustrating where naval aviation began, and how it grew, and how it's changed, it doesn't really help me. It's similar with some of the other names out there. They are great ships. They are wonderful ships. But the only name which I can really go to as one which can allow me to show the range and development and evolution of naval aviation which has taken place over the last 110 years or so, that's Ark Royal. That is Ark Royal. So that's what we're doing today. We're going to look at the way naval aviation has evolved over roughly a century through the prism of one ship's name. James Book plug. There is a competition going on. There is a competition. I am running the first ever competition on this channel I've ever run. And it is for 2 paperback versions of this. These 2 books, actually. Here. So. Okay. They are cool prizes. They are really cool prizes. They'll be personalised. I will put a note in there for you, for the authors of the winning entries in the books, as part of the prize. And it is a whole competition. There is a link down below to the competition video where I explain it all in great details. Thank you everyone who's already talking about it. Thank you to everyone who's already writing papers for it. If you're interested, please go look at it. I think it's a really cool topic. I've got really cool judges involved. Really, really cool people. I've got Glyn Stewart, the famous science fiction author. I've got Garius the Brit, who I call a different name, but that's because I meet him in real life. The famous Twitch streamer, historian, and all sorts of things he does on Earth Fund. He still does work on, well, X, formerly known as Twitter, does all sorts of wonderful threads and things like that. Got Dr. Dan, who's famous on this channel, and has his own channel, who is the medical doctor who gets dragged along by the ship-shaped team, which kind of gives a clue as to who the other judge is as well. It's Drakenfell. So all of us are going to be reading the works and deciding who gets the prizes. Honestly, I have a feeling that whilst we can't get Glyn across the Atlantic to involve meeting for a burger to discuss this all, it might well come down to us video chatting with him while the 4 of us are eating in a burger restaurant and video chatting with him. In which case, he will probably be very annoyed with us because we'll be eating lovely big burgers and he will probably be having breakfast. Which isn't really the same. Anyway. So, let's consider Ark Royal where the name comes from, because the Royal Navy picks this name. The Royal Navy Ship Naming Committee picks this name in 1912, really. They pick this name for the first ever ship to be designed and built as a seaplane carrier. The first ever ship to be built and designed to carry aircraft for a navy. Full stop. There were balloon carriers previously, but most of those were barges, lighters, and adapted ships. The first ever vessel which is built to carry, to support, facilitate heavier than air travel, to really work that all around, that's Ark Royal. And in fact, all the balloon carriers, I'm fairly sure, were conversions. Yeah, so she's completely the first. I'll just cover myself because we're going mentally. Hang on, was there a specially built balloon conversion balloon ship in the American Civil War? Don't think so. Not a big ship that goes to sea anyway. There might have been something on the rivers, so I'm going to say hold that one, but first ever ship. And they pick Ark Royal. A name which, for the Royal Navy, hadn't been around since this beast. This gorgeous vessel, which got the Armada and Cadiz as her battle honours, and then disappears. It's one of those really interesting things when I start to talk about ships naming. We talk about Ark Royal, and people go, that's such an impressive name, such an important name. It's such a name which resonates in a modern history. What were the Ark Royals of the Age of Sail doing? They didn't exist. Literally, the Royal Navy has one. It serves for Queen Elizabeth I. There's all sorts of fun things for her. And they don't have one. For 327 years? They don't have one. Why? Well, it's quite an important, quite an imperious name. At several points it's considered for first rates. It's considered so important, though, it's never actually used. The first rate which it was going to go on, the first rates which were being considered, weren't built. But it was a name always kept back for first rates. So what happens in the early 20th century? Does the Royal Navy suddenly go, this name doesn't matter anymore, we're just going to give it to anything? No. It's still important. It's critically important. You fitting Royal into the name of anything, that matters. But think about this. How many names have Royal as the second word? Not the first. Royal Sovereign, Royal George. All those, the Royal comes first. Ark Royal is rare. It's lauded, it's got history. Armada and Cadiz are not considered small battle honours in the Royal Navy's ship naming pedigree. This is not a name you just randomly pull out the drawer and go, oh, that'll do. This is a name you bestow after a lot of thought. You're not going to bestow this on a ship which doesn't matter. It's not going to be applied to a vessel which no one is going to worry about. You're not going to apply... Ark Royal is not going on the equivalent vessel of a sloop or a destroyer, or even a cruiser. It's going to go on something which matters more. Think about that. You see, quite often when I see videos and books discussing this, they make a big pomp and circumstance about this ship, but they don't really discuss the value of a name. A ship's name is a critical thing in every Navy's view. A ship's name sets the timbre for the ship. It's how you build the culture of the ship. The reason the tribal class destroyers behave and act as they do, even the World War I variants, is because they are linked to those tribes and they are supposed to set themselves apart. Those tribes are chosen for their warrior ethos, for their honour, for their sense of duty, and also as a way to outreach the Empire to make the Empire feel more like one big family. I know, it's in the corporate sense of, we're all a family, work overtime, and don't worry about if we pay you sense of we're a family, but it's all part of that idea and theory. That's a whole other discussion to get into, but the point is names matter. War Sprite starts out in this period as WAR space Sprite, and then it becomes War Sprite over the years. That's a name which matters. That's a name which has a similar level of history to Ark Royal. So this is not a name which a ship naming committee is going to apply to a vessel for jollies. And it's not going to apply it to a vessel which doesn't matter. So this is the first thing you have to think about when you're considering this entire history and talking about this. When people turn around and go, well, the Royal Navy, they're obsessed with battleships. They're just thinking about big guns. It's big guns. That's not wrong at certain points. But the same Navy, which is so obsessed, apparently, with big guns, and just thinking about that, gives this ship, this vessel, this first ever purpose-built seaplane carrier, the name Ark Royal. And it doesn't do it randomly. It isn't a tradition at this point. They aren't missing an Ark Royal. They haven't had one for 327 years at this point. They don't have to have another one. There's no one leaning over their backs going, you have to have a ship called Ark Royal. No. They've gone into their own cabinet of names. They've gone to their own book of names, their own history, and they have selected this name. There has been literally no political involvement, no one involved. In fact, there are politicians who are even arguing against building the ship because it's a waste of money. No, why are we building? Why are we spending this money not on another destroyer, a cruiser, or a battleship? But the Royal Navy's doing it. They are doing it. And what's she built for? Well, she ends up in the Dardanelles campaign providing aerial reconnaissance and observation missions. In fact, that's exactly what she's for. Reconnaissance, observation, and spotting. Yes, it is the Royal Navy thinking about its battleships' guns, but it's thinking about them in a different way than you might be thinking of. Battleship guns are the most powerful weapons of anyone at this period in the 1914. There is no question. You can't make the case for pretty much anything else. No, some of the big battleships rock up to you, you have got problems. A whole fleet of them rock up next to you, you've got very big problems. Incoming. Laced with high explosive. Ark Royal is about making sure those battleships will find their targets, the enemy fleet preferably, will be able to track in on those targets, the enemy fleet again, and then when they get close to them, spot those targets through smoke so that they accurately and more efficiently destroy those targets. That is what Ark Royal is for. She is probably the most powerful, minimally armed vessel in her era, because she might carry 4 12-pounder, that's 3-inch 76mm guns, primarily for AA and self-defense, but her 8 float planes. Those allow her to direct and control the entire Grand Fleet. That is the idea anyway. Sadly enough, at Jutland, this idea doesn't work because the radios break down. Technology. It's always so good to be at its cutting edge, but sometimes it does break on you. Now, Ark Royal is a good ship. It's a really good ship for this. And she's a very simple construction. She's got 3 boilers, she's got a single triple expansion engine, a single shaft, and a top speed of 11 knots. Why? Because frankly, when they're designing her and putting together, they're not thinking about her racing around, keeping up with the fleet. They're thinking she's going to find somewhere to operate far away from the battle, preferably, a safe distance, and operate her aircraft. Now, yeah. There's a small problem very quickly realised in that issue, which is called Abakur, Cressy and Hogue. I.e., you stop a ship, it gets sunk by torpedoes. Ouch! That might not work. And so she gets used in Dardanelles and other operations, and the Royal Navy tries to develop other ships to be faster moving, maintaining contact with fleet carriers, mostly converting them. But Ark Royal when she's laid down, is the first forays into, we are trying to design this, and they use the precedence of this wonderful name. And that name means this ship has import. She has value. Again, I cannot overstate the concept that when you're give a ship a name like this, it matters. It matters. And well, this particular Ark Royal gets converted to being called Pegasus. Not long after taking part in operations trying to support the White Russians, and goes off and spends some time helping out the Australians, and then gets returned to the UK, and does all sorts of little jobs throughout the interwar years. She's really quite useful, and even in the Second World War she's being used again, still it's called Pegasus by that point, but again, that's going to be saved for her key ships video. And then we have the second aircraft carrier Ark Royal, third ship to be named Ark Royal. Now, this is an important vessel for many, many reasons. One, it's treaty compliant with the proposals Britain's putting down. Two, it's Britain's strike carrier, the first one they build from the scratch up. And that matters. Again. Why does it matter? Because Britain is looking at the treaties. It's looking at the treaties and it's realizing it's got a problem. One, it can't afford to build as big a ships as the Americans and the Japanese because it needs more ships from its tonnage. Because it has more areas it has to cover. And it has to cover those areas because the big advantage of the glorious British Empire is that it's a maritime trading empire which can move goods from one side of the world to the other to arraign and support operations. It's amazing. The big disadvantage of having the world's largest maritime empire is you have to protect those trade routes which you would like to move those goods and supplies from one side of the world to the other. Which, when you've got a lot of water to cover, means you really want a lot of aircraft carriers, because they have planes that fly off them and cover a lot of water far more quickly than ships can. And allow you to spot those surface raiders, which are far more annoying in some parts of the world than submarines, far more quickly. Because let's be honest, there are parts of the world where you're unlikely to find enemy submarines operating, but you will find their surface raiders, and you want to shut those down as quickly as possible, because surface raiders are pound for pound more lethal. Yes, they do have to leak out, which means you can try and stop them more easily getting out than submarines, which, let's be honest, the submarines in World War I and World War II are basically submersible torpedo boats, but leaving that to one side, you need carriers. The thing is, the Royal Navy also needed carriers to do their war missions, which again stretched around the world, which meant they needed to supply them around the world. Okay. They needed to sustain them around the world. They needed to maintain them around the world. This is one of the reasons which leads to the armoured carrier idea, is a more survivable aircraft carrier you can operate on the far side of the world from your industrial base, and if it gets damaged you can more easily repair it in forward positions, less likely to have to send a carrier back home to be repaired. Yes, it operates a smaller air group because it's built more for survivability, but the thing is, the question is you're always asked is whether it's better to have less aircraft or no aircraft. That's not a situation you want to be in, but that's literally the choice the British are looking at when they're looking at the Far East deployments and thinking about the range of deployments. Now, Ark Royal is often filtered by some people going, well, she looks more like some of the American and Japanese carriers, so she must be Britain's Pacific carrier. No, she's Britain's strike carrier. And they have all sorts of ideas for her, because, you see, when she's built, she comes about in a very interesting period. The British have had several committees working, studying World War One non-stop. The three big things they've got out of World War One are, one, an obsession with anti-submarine warfare, which is borderline an actual debilitating illness. They are obsessed with it, so much so that ships practice zigzagging on a daily basis, which is one of the reasons why war begins and ships start zigzagging. Even if they're nowhere near any enemy submarines, they're nowhere near any scenario where they're likely to come across an enemy submarine, they are still zigzagging. Abakur, Cressy, and Hogue. If you don't know the story, basically 3 older cruisers were on patrol in the North Sea, got caught by one submarine, all lost. Large numbers of their crew lost. Absolutely terrifying and terrible experience for the Royal Navy, and something they vow never to repeat. Second thing was that the German High Seas Fleet escaped from them at night. They escaped from them at night. And that's how Jutland ended up being the result it was, because the Germans were able to get past them at night, and so they couldn't track them and take them out, or fight them at night. This distressed them greatly. This gave several admirals, British admirals, a nervous affliction bordering on that inflicted upon the US Navy by the sea control ship Saga. I mean, seriously, it was terrifying. The third thing was the German Navy hid in port. Don't you hear that? They hid in port. This is one of the reasons why the Royal Navy spends years practicing aerial drop torpedoes and obsessing over how they land. This is why the Royal Navy has... Fine. I can't find my fluffy torpedo at the moment. I do have one I usually say as a demonstration, but there are videos about it. This is why they obsess with making their torpedoes belly flop. Because that means when they land in the water, they don't sink down as deep and they will run through, which makes them better for harbour operations. Something you don't have to worry about at sea. Fleet battles as a problem, but you have to worry about in harbour attacks. The Royal Navy gets obsessive. I mean, they are testing these torpedoes everywhere in the world. One of the reasons why the Royal Navy doesn't have torpedo problems the Americans and the Germans and pretty much every other power does have at the beginning of World War II is because they've been so obsessive with testing how their torpedoes drop and operate in shallow waters and how they can use them, that has spun off into all sorts of data in other areas, which has allowed them to refine their torpedoes. Literally that obsession. Secondly, you need to deliver that. Well, that means you need an aircraft, like the Swordfish, which is great at night strikes, and flying low, slow, and stably, so it will do the perfect drop of the torpedo, the absolute perfect drop of that torpedo, every time with minimal pilot causing problems. And you need a carrier which will launch it. They also have another scenario for this, because they know that Courageous and Glorious can last them for a while, but with only 2 strike carriers, they can't guarantee the availability of one. They know to guarantee the availability, you need 3. 3 vessels pretty much allows you to guarantee the availability. And the reality is, they have another role, not just the harbour strike. You see, if you're going to build carriers like the Illustrious class, which are great for the constant flow of aircraft, for the constant flow, or for providing a constant strike, a constant drumbeat, a constant fighter patrol above your fleet in action and combat, you also need something that can do that. You need the Alpha Strike capability. You need the big hit. Or at least in a multi-carrier operation, which is why the Royal Navy has a rear admiral aircraft carriers from 1930, who's the... Actually, that's Admiral Henderson, who goes on to build the Royal Navy's fleet. You need a carrier that you can build that strike around. So let's say your other carriers are all orientated around this. So they might be able to launch a squadron and a bit wave, and then another squadron and a bit wave. Well, if they can be grouped around one of these, which can launch a full-on half a flight group, or even maybe full flight group, wave attack, well then suddenly that Alpha Strike becomes a lot more menacing. And yes, you would prefer to keep this one slightly further back from fleet operations, slightly further away from the danger zone, but that's why she's fast. That's why she's built the way she is. She's big, she's more self-sufficient. Again, another reason for doing that and for building her the workshops, etc. she has, is to make her slightly more self-sufficient so she can be operating slightly more differently than the fleet train. Can be doing raiding operations, perhaps, another concept they're considering using for her. So she is really a good example of how aviation is being considered in the 1930s. Because you've got the dichotomy between her and the Illustrious class, or these two levels, fleet operations versus independent carrier operations. And this is really the Royal Navy's independent carrier operation. It's for the strike, it's for that development of capabilities. And again, it's another thing which I tend to point to all this complexity going, all these discussions and all this nuance going on, as a thing of saying, don't write off any navy as being one way or another. Their navies are often big organizations, especially in the 1920s and 30s. They are big, massive organizations with rooms for many different people who are thinking through many different things. In terms of naval aviation development, they have an idea that things are coming, that aircraft are getting better and better and better. They don't think aircraft are there yet. And that's really understandable. Let's be honest, the Swordfish is considered the primary strike aircraft for the Royal Navy, primarily because it carries a torpedo. They're not sure if bombs will start enough fires that they will sink ships. They do know torpedoes will make holes that will sink ships, and they've done that. That's happened in World War I with aircraft dropping torpedoes. So they know this can happen. This is something they are therefore prepared to rely on. But she also has space for them to develop more. But again, it's all within the treaty limitations. And that's something you have to consider again. She's a good example of this period because treaty limitations are defining her. She's not defined entirely by what the Royal Navy wants or needs, because if they had their way, she would be about an extra 3,500–4,000 tons, have an armoured flight deck. The flight deck's the strength deck, so it could have been armoured. Still have all the space, all the capabilities, all the aircraft. And they build a class of her. And all their carriers would be able to be the strike carrier and the constant operation carrier. But the thing is, when you're trying to build X number of carriers for a cumulative total of under 135,000 tons, you've got to think like that. She unfortunately has a sad ending. Her ending is really a case of... Well, the Royal Navy has good doctrine for damage control. The trouble is, the doctrine for damage control on aircraft carriers is slightly different because they're top heavy. And I'll get into this when I do the ship's key ships. But the trouble is, a lot of the specialists for damage control on carriers go down in Courageous and Glorious. And so while they're training up people, they have to take people from elsewhere, and they bring in senior people who should know what they're doing from ship service and should follow the manuals. However, a lot of them don't. They're used to being on ships where, on smaller ships, on cruisers, and even on battleships, you don't tend to counterflood. counter-flooding is very much your last resort. Whereas on an aircraft carrier, which is very top-heavy, counter-flooding is actually something you do rather earlier on. You see the problem here. They come in, they see the manual tells them to do one thing. But all their experience, all their training, and the manuals as it applies to every other ship tells them to do the other thing. So what do you do when you're on an emergency? When you're in a crisis, what do you do? They go with their historical experience. And that's wrong. It doesn't happen again. But it's what costs the Royal Navy ultimately Ark Royal. She's torpedoed by the enemy. Yes, she's got damage. But the basic agreement of the thing is no one's really at fault. They are at fault for not following procedure. But the thing is they were following all their training and prior experience. You prefer them not to have been following the manual. So you can censure them, but you can't really call them at fault because under that extremist of circumstances. And again, I'll do a video about it, and when I'm talking about key ships for this video, I'll get into that in more detail. But very quickly, they decide they want another one. The Audacious class Ark Royal. They want another ship. And this is really interesting because she's in literally the class which is before the Maltas, which were going to be the Royal Navy's counterparts to the Midways. The Royal Navy finally throwing off the treaty shackles entirely and building something which was the combined armoured slash strike carrier, fleet and strike carrier combined of their dreams. So this vessel is very much an almost there of the dreams. And it's still a very cool class. The Audacious class are really good ships, and for much of the Cold War, this was the centerpiece of the Royal Navy. Yes, the Americans have far bigger carriers, but this, for many people around the world, represents an achievable scale of fleet carrier, an operational capability of a fleet carrier. And that's what the British have. It operates a very interesting range of aircraft. At various times, it operates Hawker Seahawks, de Havilland Sea Venoms, Fairey Gannets, Western Wyverns, Graham Avengers, McDonnell Douglas Phantoms, Blackburn Buccaneers, Supreme Scimitars, de Havilland Sea Vixens, Westland Dragonflies, Westland Sea Kings, and Westland Wessexes. It has a massively long and valuable experience, serving from 1954 till 1978. 24 years. And for those 24 years, it was the centerpiece of British capability and British presence around the world. It is the vessel around which Britain builds its task groups in the 60s and the 70s. You want air defense for your fleet? Well, you want a carrier. There are reasons for that, okay? Actually, those reasons are even more stark today. In the 1950s and 60s, most of your missile systems were swivel arm systems, and you could reload those at sea. Yes, it was complicated. Yes, magazines weren't massive, but you could reload them at sea. The missiles were altogether slightly more, how do I put this? Less lethal, but ultimately simpler and slightly more rugged machines because of that simplicity. They had less bits in them to go wrong. Modern missiles are still rugged, but they have more bits in them which can go wrong if you bash them, so you want to be really, really careful of things. And modern VLS, there are theoretical systems. There were systems the Americans had on the Ticos, Ticonderoga class cruisers, etc. There were systems they had which would allow them, which were cranes, which allowed them to reload. But reloading at sea is very difficult. The thing was, you were far more easily able to package and reload at sea your aircraft carrier. Replenishment at sea of an aircraft carrier, that's something which is fairly easy to do. So you want to up the air defense, you want to rearm, you can reload your aircraft carrier. So its fighters can always have enough missiles for your outer air defense. its strike aircraft can always have enough bombs and enough other weapons to act as the strike power. And then the rest of your task group is around providing layers around that carrier to allow it to reach out. To allow it to reach out and affect things. Ark Royal is that tool. Aircraft carriers are that tool in this period. They are, if you are a serious nation and you want to be taken seriously on the world stage, you need an aircraft carrier. Honestly, that's half the reason why the Russians end up building the Kiev class and other classes after that, is because it's what you need to be taken seriously because of its utility and because of the viability of it brings to task groups. Task groups with it have this ability to rearm and project power a long way away from them. They have this ability to defend themselves a long way away from them. They have this ability to project themselves a long way away from them. And that's useful. In an era of shrinking hull numbers, aircraft carriers were a way of mitigating that fact. That's what Ark Royal was. For many years, we have talked in Britain, and other nations around the world, of doing more with less. Well, aircraft carriers are a classic example of that. Because you're able to affect a far larger area with less ships. If you try and affect the same area with just surface ships, just escorts, or destroyers, cruisers, frigates, whatever you want to call them, you'll need far more to have a similar level of reach as that task group of an aircraft carrier will have. Far more. Why? Well, as most famously, in an incident over Belize, Ark Royal showed, just flying over an area, in fact a pair of buccaneers doing a flight over an area, can make nations seriously consider the wiseness of their course of actions and whether they should perhaps chart a new course, chart a new path through the cosmos. Sometimes it's a tough one to think about, but they get there. The thing is, though, she's a big fleet carrier. A big fleet carrier. And therefore represents a big target. Not just for the enemy, who will be out to get her, but that's the whole point of the task group. It's never about individual ships, it's about the sum of the force they provide together as a group. But also to the Treasury and other sections within the Ministry of Defence and parts of government to try and claim she's a white elephant. She's something too expensive. You don't need her. You don't need her. She's a relic. You don't need air defense? You don't need strike capability? No. You don't need the anti-submarine warfare capability she brings? No. The airborne early warning she brings? No. You don't need any of that. Why not? The arguments range from the Cold War's going to be over in a couple of days because it's going to go nuclear, to all sorts of fun arguments were made against fleet carriers, and they still hang around today. It's really interesting. It's sometimes you'll hear this argument come from, and I'm going to say army officers, but you also get it from navy officers, but most recently I've heard it from an army officer who was honestly putting forward the argument that aircraft carriers are unnecessary in modern warfare because what you need are drones and the soldiers on the ground to deploy them. When asked how the drones and the soldiers on the ground were going to get there without sea power to get them there, his response was train. Now, there are parts of the world that can be done, but also that seems to me a very limited approach. But it did actually show someone had thought about it, so I was impressed by that. Wasn't impressed by the answer, I can dismantle that in about 2 seconds. But I was impressed that he'd actually tried to think of an answer. And this is the trouble, because they They used all that to get rid of the fleet carriers, and then they realised very quickly, oh frigate, we need them, but we can't honestly admit we need them. They cancelled CVO-1, which was going to be an aircraft carrier project and all sorts of things, which was supposed to replace the audacious class vessels of Ark Royal and her sister Eagle. And they were supposed to be replaced by CVO-1, but that had been cancelled, and then Ark Royal and Eagle got too old and got rid of. But the trouble is, you still need those aircraft carriers if you're actually going to operate, but we can't admit. At that point, you can't admit. And that's okay, because at this point, a new aircraft had entered the world, the Harrier. And that offered the opportunity for everyone to lie. And pretend they weren't trying to replace the capability. They were just, I don't know what, getting something which would be useful for the anti-submarine warfare. Yes, it was going to carry a lot of helicopters for anti-submarine warfare. Oh, and these things called Harriers, which have an air defense capability and a strike capability. The thing was, they were playing such slow boats with this that it took ages to get things like airborne early warning into progress. You know, people often critique Britain and go, well, you've got helicopters for your airborne early warning. That's not as good as Hawkeye, the American fixed-wing Catabar system. And honestly, it's not. They're different. Believe it or not, the helicopter system does have advantages in certain areas. But it's more like in some areas it's 6 of one, half a dozen the other, and the context and nuance means that you might favour one system over the other because of the specifics. But overall, the Hawkeye is a better system. But ask someone if they prefer to have no system or the helicopter-based airborne early warning. And if they say no, they're lying. Something is always better than nothing. And a lot of the losses from the Falklands War could be mitigated by that. These ships, these carriers, some points called through-deck... there is often discussions whether they were called through-deck cruisers or not, and people go, well, on the designs, does it appear or not? And there is a sort of discussion as whether it evolves from a cruiser requirement into a through-deck cruiser, into a light carrier, and there are all sorts of discussions. But honestly, I would say this. The through-deck cruiser description of them is actually quite an honest joke. Because the Royal Navy was not building aircraft carriers anymore. Everyone was sure. It's kind of like HMS Unicorn, built prior to World War II, was honestly not an aircraft carrier. It's a forward aviation support ship. Well, this was honestly not an aircraft carrier again. They're through-deck cruisers. And it's more of a subtle dig at the politics of it all than it is a reality. It's a dig at what people were saying, because the reality was you still needed those capabilities. You still needed the aircraft carrier. You still needed the strike range and the capability aircraft bring to an organic fleet. You need the outer edge, especially when you're dealing with missiles and aircraft like those the Soviet Union were wielding. And again, we usually focus in on, well, you know, the Harrier's main purpose was to go and shoot down bears before they give the targeting information to the black backfires and the other Soviet bombers. And you go, yeah, that's in the role of an aircraft carrier. Believe it or not, that's what aircraft carriers were doing in the Bay of Biscay. They were shooting down Condors before they gave the position away to U-boats, Wolfpacks, and other strike aircraft, and the same in North Atlantic. But they can do that role and also provide an outer area air defense and provide some strike capabilities. They can do all those at the same time. It's not the same level. This is not, by any stretch of the imagination, the same level as this. But the thing was, no one could admit that Britain really needed this capability. No one could admit that when they got rid of this, they'd fundamentally undermined Britain's security by putting pretty much all their eggs in the basket of any Cold War turned hot is going to be a short war. Admittedly, the trouble is that's only one scenario. These vessels are most famous for fighting in the Falklands War. One of her sisters fought down there, HMS Invincible. They are famous for all the duties they've done in wars since. They were a very useful tool, and arguably one of the reasons why we now have the Queen Elizabeth class are that these proved quite so useful. And the reality was, you needed them to be bigger. Again, we have issues with the politics of it, but defence procurement is always to an extent about politics. And that's one of the really interesting things about this name and the history of these ships, because the vessel which had the least politics involved in it is this. The first one. Least politics involved in her procurement. Least politics by any stretch of the imagination. This is the Navy pushing and procuring this. People sometimes talk about Winston Churchill, etc. He had barely any idea this was happening. This is defined by the Washington Naval Treaty. She is defined by the Washington Naval Treaty. This vessel is defined by the end of World War II and by politicians not wanting to push forward with buying things like the Malta class, and instead trying to spend all sorts of money upgrading Victorious, and then finding that that didn't work, despite that was supposed to be marketed as a cheap option, and then going with Ark, Royal and Eagle and having them do the duty. And then finally making a political decision based on the idea that carriers weren't going to be needed, that we weren't going to be needed. Britain wasn't going to need to have commitments in the Far East. There were still allies, there were still alliances, there were still commitments and trade, reasons to be out there and wander and have the ability to project power out there, but you didn't need it. And then, after they made that decision, Britain kept having to operate out there and kept having to deploy out there. But don't worry, they cut the resources for it. But they managed to make out of it by the image of these ships appearing. And it's the same with with Belize and the Caribbean and everywhere else in the world. And then eventually they come along and they decide that the most dangerous war that we could find ourselves in is going to be over very quickly. And so you don't need carriers as part of that. You don't need that capability. So we don't need those. We can concentrate on the ground force in Germany and we can ignore the sea and the stretch. What you really need was to fund both. That's one of the things I find strange. People accept the dichotomy and go, well, honestly, they were right. They should have funded the army in Germany over the carriers. The army is more important. You need both. And it's not exactly saving a lot of money, because very quickly, what do they have to do? They have to turn around and build, honestly, not carriers. And do a whole load of independent development. Whereas the CVO-1 was being built and would have been able to share aircraft and all sorts of things with the Americans and the French and could have all been joint. But this, no, we have to go down this route. And we have to develop everything ourselves because we were the leaders in it. And they were good ships. Do not get me wrong, I'm not critiquing these vessels. They are good ships. But the whole through-deck cruiser analogy that's used about them and the jokes about them are literally the Royal Navy saying, well, you wouldn't let us get aircraft carriers, so we've got a through-deck cruiser. Oh, it's an aircraft carrier. Because, frankly, the only thing that fitted the role and the requirements of what we needed to do was an aircraft carrier. One of their criteria was to be able to provide support to get the Amphibious Brigade, 3rd Commando Brigade, and the British and Dutch forces to Norway through the face of enemy strikes. And ultimately, this is the problem for aircraft carriers and naval aviation as a whole. And for all ships which are capital ships, but aircraft carriers have always been capital ships. From the very beginning, as Ark Royal name suggests, it's already an asset. It's already a capital vessel in status, if not in purpose, but in status. They have always been about the politics of their use and their funding. This name, its entire history, has been defined by politics, barring the first vessel. And that's an important thing to think about when we're thinking about naval aviation, when we're thinking about these assets and their utility. When you are thinking about why is X not being used, why is X being positioned here, it's a political decision. Deploying an aircraft carrier, deploying a carrier battle group, that is a political decision. Its use, its operation, that is a naval decision. How it's operating in sort of the scenarios, how it's being positioned around, where its escorts are, how the aircraft are doing in terms of air defense, etc. That is all a naval decision. But whether it's allowed to strike at targets, whether it's even allowed to be in the area, those are political decisions, because aircraft carriers have that value. Naval aviation has that value, that status, that reach. It has that utility. So, with that in mind, what's today's question? Well, we're now at conception, operation, conclusion of the Ark Royals, and next week is British World War II carrier naval aviation doctrine, pre-war to war. So basically a chunk of my PhD thesis distilled into some slides. It's going to be fun, and I gave you a bit of a taster of what it's going to have in it today. Well, the question is this. You cannot free aircraft carriers and development of carriers from politics, and their use from politics. You can't. But what I'd like you to look at is to go in through history and look at the aircraft carriers which have been procured. And think about whether the forces involved, the armed forces, would have procured those ships if they'd been solely in charge. And what the politicians would have liked to procure if they'd been solely responsible. If they hadn't been faced with the fact that the admirals might all resign and quit, and newspapers and politics of that would look bad. Because for that reason, every aircraft carrier, including the American supercarriers, are compromises. They are compromises between the politicians, the political class, and the professional warrior class. And honestly, the people who straddle both worlds in the middle, the defense secretaries, the admirals, they have to act as go-betweens, and to an extent the academics have to act as go-betweens between these two groups to allow them to reach some sort of understanding. These ships are a compromise. Ultimately, you can say the politicians have the whip hand because they have to sign off on the checks, they have to sign off on the funding, they and the Treasury have to agree, or whichever department you want to talk about is controlling the funding, depending on each country, has to sign off. But it's also the fact that the politics can go both ways, and if all the admirals resign because of the aircraft carriers, and there's a famous example in the construction of the Ark Royals and the Invincible class, there's a really famous example. The first Sea Lord and the senior admiral and another senior admiral basically threatened to resign because originally the idea was to fit them for, not with, their missiles and guns. And the admiral said, "You will not give me a flagship which is unarmed, or I will quit." And there was enough gold braid in front of the Treasury and the politicians. It was scary. So that they were fitted with, not for. So the question is, go back and look at classes, especially those built since World War II, because it's more accurate since World War II and more obvious to look at. And ask yourself what the Navy would have built and what the politicians would have built. Or would they have built anything? That's an important thing to think about. The odds are usually they wouldn't have built nothing. But what they might have built could have been very different. Anyway, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I get told off by YouTube if I don't do this, so if you've liked the video, please like. There's a button down there. If you'd like to see more videos like this, there's a subscribe button, I'm told, down there somewhere. And there's also membership and Patreon and Ko-fi if you wish to support the channel. And frankly, the channel is entirely supported by you, so thank you very much to everyone who allows me to keep my book habit and my naval history research alive. Thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed the video. Hope you found it interesting. And hope you're looking forward to the year of the aircraft carrier. Take care. I've got to stop re-recording these at the last minute. Or rather, not liking them re-recording last minute.